I'm Dan Miller.
I'm Kevin Stern. At Miller Stern Lawyers, we are honored to serve the community that we love. We work for you.
For over a decade, we've spent our days and nights fighting for you. We believe in justice. We believe in fighting for what's right.
That's why we are proud to sponsor a community conversation to make a better Baltimore.
It takes guts to stand up for justice and accountability and demand better.
And we can do it by giving you a voice in your future.
At Miller Stern, we're fighting for a better Baltimore.
Baltimore, Charm City, neighborhoods full of history, great people, and lots of potential. A city trying to clean up its act after years of decay. A place where children should be safe to play on clean streets. But the pockets of problems are growing. Grime and crime make for bad neighbors. And now, even the once pristine parts of our wonderful city are in the fight of their lives to stop a city plagued by crime, grime, corruption, and failing schools. From Fox 45 News, this is a Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall, the Save Our City Tour. Neighbors helping neighbors, council district by council district.
Good evening and thanks for joining us to the St. Luke Evangelical Church in Northeast Baltimore. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Tonight is our 6th installment of the Fox 45 Save Our City Town Hall Tour, where we go to each council district listening to the constituents' concerns and possible solutions to some of the problems plaguing Baltimore City. Our focus tonight is in the 3rd District. We're going to talk about education, specifically the broad, serious problems facing Baltimore City public schools following last week's hearing where the City Council Education Committee asked only one question about these failures that the district themselves have confirmed is happening at least one school. Now, we invited several elected leaders tonight to this discussion, including both Mayor Brandon Scott and District 3 Councilman Ryan Dorsey, but both of them refusing to attend. Now tonight, let's take a look and introduce our panel. First, introduce former Governor Bob Ehrlich. The governor served Maryland from 2003 to 2007. He represented Maryland's 2nd congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1995 to 2003. And before that, he was a member of the Maryland House of Delegates. Next, Thiru Vignarajah, former Baltimore City mayoral candidate, product of Baltimore City school system, former federal prosecutor, and Deputy Attorney General of Maryland, who says fixing the problems in Baltimore City starts with education. Next, we have David Marshall Wright, who's a former District 3 council candidate as well. Thank you for joining us. And Pastor Shannon Wright, former mayoral candidate, leader of the Urban Engagement Initiative, which has said Baltimore City school system could be facing a lawsuit threatening to sue if the city school CEO, Dr. Sonia Santelises, is not removed. Panelists, thank you for joining us. We have a robust discussion ahead of us. And like we mentioned, I want to start with the recent news. We have the education hearing that happened Thursday night. Really, quite honestly, a fake hearing, because really one question was asked about the failures, and Augusta Fells was never even mentioned. 2.5 hours long, and one question about ghost students and grade changing. We also asked the public before the hearing to send us some questions, and I want to read a few of them, of the questions that they sent to us. How will the school system prevent it from happening in the future? Will anyone be fired? How long has it been happening? And will you authorize an audit from the school system? These questions never asked by the elected leaders elected to serve and question and hold leaders accountable. None of those questions were asked. And I want to start with why those questions weren't asked. If somebody could explain that to me and the city, that would be great. Former Governor, why don't we start with you?
Questions weren't asked because everybody knows the answer. And the answer is the status quo has been the status quo, dysfunctional for decades. The fine people to my right here care. Folks in church here care. There have been administrators who care, lots of teachers who care. But when you take the long-term perspective, this story is the story today. It was the story last week. It was the story last year. It was the story 10 years ago. It was the story 30 years ago. People are almost tired of hearing it, and to the extent politicians respond to squeaky wheels. to the extent there hasn't been a squeaky enough wheel with regard to everybody who cares about this issue over decades, they'll never respond. You'll only get movement on this issue and get our kids their constitutional rights, which they deserve, which they should have, if enough people scream, stand up, and say bloody murder. I've had enough. I've had enough. Enough of dysfunction. Enough of kids failing. Enough of a dysfunctional school system. Enough of deprivation of constitutional rights. Enough. And in my tenure here in public life and since public life, I haven't heard it at the volume we need to get it to.
Mr. Victoraj, I want to go to you because as a former prosecutor, if this was your case, first of all, do you see the solutions, or do you see what we've seen come out of this investigation? First of all, is it criminal? And if this was your case, given the silence that we've seen from city council members and the school board, the school district, these leaders, what does their silence signify to you?
Yeah, let's start with the criminal dimension of this. Look, you don't have to be a former federal prosecutor to see the writing on the wall. The CEO of schools herself has acknowledged that other agencies have been engaged in this. And what that means is that people are looking very carefully to see whether they have the evidence to actually set out a conspiracy. Because that's what this looks like. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a coordinated effort by school officials to deprive children of the education that they need, and to do that by stealing money, not just from the federal government, not just from the state government, not just from the local government, but from the taxpayers. That's who they're stealing from, and they're willing to lie and fabricate and make things up at the expense of the children to make sure that those schools get more money than they deserve. So yeah, I think there's a pretty clear case to be investigated.
Quick follow-up to that, because listening to this hearing that never once mentioned Augusta Fowles asked one question. Are the members of the city council and this committee, are they responsible? Do they have the duty to their constituents to ask these questions? And if they don't, could they be responsible and implicated in this if it does come to criminal charges?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything more frustrating than the complete silence from our elected officials. And I frankly have gotten to the point where I'm sort of tired of waiting for them to step up and do something. I'm not even surprised anymore they don't ask these questions. I'm not surprised that they don't show up to these forums. What, they're 0 for 6? We've had 6 forums, and not a single elected official has come to one of these, because it's no longer some inadvertent decision for them not to show up. It's not a mistake that they forgot to ask the really thoughtful but kind of basic questions that the public needs to hear. It is a conscious, deliberate political calculus. They know this is their fault. They know they are complicit in the outrage that has unfolded. They know that they would be kicked out of office if we held them responsible. So what they're hoping for is that we don't pay attention to the fact that this is happening on their watch. And if they don't ask the hard questions, if literally you can't quote them asking these questions, then maybe when election time comes along, the people will forget. They're counting on the people not to show up. They're counting on the people not to pay attention. And once and for all, the people that are in this room and all around listening need to finally step up and say enough is enough.
Mr. Wright, you live in this district. Your council member is not here tonight. You ran against him in the election last year. Is it acceptable to you as not just a former candidate, but a constituent to listen to the silence from these elected leaders?
No, it's not acceptable. And to be honest with you, when we talk about this hearing that takes place, not only one question was asked. Well, guess what? If they can only ask one question, then we need to start asking just 2 questions. Are you complicit, or are you just incompetent? Are you not able to do your job? Are you not able to represent the people? Do you take the people for granted, or do you want to uphold your oath in office? And if you say, okay, I uphold my oath, well, then how do these things take place? That tells us either you're incompetent or you're complicit. You're in on it. That's why the questions aren't being asked. I mean, let's all just let the elephant in the room have its moment. Guess what? These folks are all in bed together. Do you think there's anything that happens at North Avenue that city government doesn't know about? Do you think it's anything but city government can't have oversight over North Avenue? These folks are friends. These folks get along together. These folks are scratching each other's backs. I'm sure if we look at campaign contributions from the last go-around, you'll see a lot of folks who are in the BTU and in Baltimore City schools made a lot of donations to a lot of folks who aren't asking a lot of questions right now. So, I mean, let's just be open and honest about this system that has developed and has allowed our children to just be taken advantage of to not have their constitutional right to an education. And then the worst sin is, after 12 years in the Baltimore City school system, we give them a piece of paper that's worthless now because they don't have the basic skills to go out and compete in secondary education, to join our nation's armed forces, to seek a career, or to even go to a trade school.
I'm glad you brought up performance because we were just talking about a study, data where the federal government came in and tested the 4th and 8th graders. And I want to read, the 4th graders were tested in math. 85% of 4th graders in Baltimore City school system were not proficient. But the numbers got worse the longer they were in the city school system. By the time they got to 8th grade, 90% of these students were not proficient in math. Pastor Wright, would you send your students or your children to school in Baltimore City schools if you knew this information that indicates, based on this federal testing data, that the longer they're in there, the worse they're going to perform?
Absolutely not. No parent in their right mind should be sending their children to school in Baltimore City. Let me say that again. No parent in their right mind should be sending their children to school in Baltimore City. If you are over the age of 50, you are around at least at the tail end of the civil rights. You know how hard people fought in this country to get quality public education. And you're just going to lay down and go to sleep and let Baltimore City do this to your children? It's unacceptable. Dr. Santelises should be forced to enroll her own children in Baltimore City schools. Then I will believe that you're actually doing your best.
Can I push back on one thing Pastor Wright said? Because I think Pastor Wright is correct that most parents love their children, and if they had a choice between sending their kids to a county school, if they had the choice between sending their kids to a private school over the options that exist in Baltimore City, with a very few number of exceptions, they wouldn't send them. But there are a handful of schools that we know do well.
Correct.
Hampstead Hill Elementary School, City Poly and School for the Arts. If you talk to people that say, oh, I'm so proud of sending my kids to public schools in Baltimore City, I promise you that their kids go to one of those 4 or 5 schools. If you don't have the option to go to one of those schools and you don't have the means or money to move to the county or send your kids to the private school, it's not that these parents don't care about their children. They love their children as much as we love our children. It's that they have no option. We are condemning them and their children to an education which literally, the more they stay in the city school system, the dumber they seem to get. The worse they seem to perform. What kind of school system has kids that are getting worse as they spend year after year, and by the way, hundreds of millions of dollars year after year, and the performance gets worse? It's ridiculous.
There's a common theme here. There's a common, everybody sees the head shaking in the room. And again, as I said earlier, go back and check your stories from 10 years ago and 20 years ago. It's the same numbers. It's the same dysfunction. It's the same failing schools. It's the same frustrated parents. It's the same subset of politicians who want to do something, but not enough. So we're basically using this word, and it's correct. I love this last point because there are a couple of these really outstanding schools, but with respect to most of these kids and most of the parents, they're sentenced to those schools. And as a result, we fail them at a moral level, we fail them at a constitutional level, and we fail them at a pragmatic level. And I tried to make, as governor, as congressman, as a state legislator, all of us try to make, depending on the audience, maybe all 3 points. And when I talk about pragmatic level, to the extent we fail these kids generation after generation, then we're surprised when X amount of kids end up in the juvenile system or the adult system. We're shocked. We're just shocked about that.
And Mackenzie, don't take our word for it. I mean, if the people in the audience could just raise their hand, if you had to choose between Augusta Fells High School and Gilman High School, or Augusta Fells High School and Pikesville High School, or Augusta Fells High School and, frankly, any private school in the state of Maryland, or any high school outside the city of Baltimore, raise your hand if you would send them to one of those schools, Gilman or those other schools. Is there anybody that would choose Augusta Fells for their child? Is there a single person? Of course not. And the part that I think is really frustrating and is insulting to the people of Baltimore is when the mayor and the city council pretend it's not their responsibility. They say crime is not their job because the police department is a state agency. They say education is not their job because the school system is a state agency. Shame on them for peddling that lie. They are responsible for the things that are happening.
We'll come back to that in a second. I want to bring Mr. Ehrlich into this because I know that when you were governor, you talked a lot about what the state can do and what your role as governor could do to help city schools. Can you explain how you attempted to step in and what happened after that?
Everybody in the panel's too young to remember this, but we had a provision. Nancy Grassman came to me one day, state superintendent of schools, and said, look, under No Child Left Behind, the federal law, we can come in and reform these schools. We can open some, we can expand some, we can close others, we can go public charter and others, we can go residential charter. We can do some things to literally rescue these kids sentenced to the worst 11 schools in Baltimore City. And then the legislature read the story, and the legislature moved to shut me down, and they did. And then they had a celebration to mark their victory over poor kids, black and white, Hispanic, poor mostly, in these failing schools. And nobody said anything. It was all politics. It stunk then. It stinks today. And I just, sometimes I wonder, you see the anger here. The anger's everywhere in this church tonight. We need to be angry. At some point, the anger has to reach the point, as I said earlier, of reaching that inflection point. That point where we're literally, as taxpayers, as citizens, as parents, as people, we've had enough. Sometimes in other cities, they've reached that point. We haven't reached that point here. We need to reach that point at some point in time. And if we don't, we're going to be meeting in the same church in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, different panelists, same message, same frustrated parents.
Let me ask you this. Given the investigations that have happened and the reporting that has been done, and we're hearing from people inside the school system right now telling us stories of their fear of retaliation, and they're getting their verbal assault and potentially physical assault as well, and they're afraid to speak out. What would it take, or is there somebody at the state level who could step in and have that subpoena power to really get to the bottom of this, essentially, since we're seeing city council members not do it?
I believe that's what our Attorney General's office is for. I mean, this looks like nothing more than criminal malfeasance. We have funds that aren't being used correctly. We have children that are not being educated. We have a problem that everybody in this room knows about. It sounds like someone down in Annapolis and the Attorney General's office should pick this thing up and run with it. But when we have this conversation, and let's really frame this, when we talk about failing schools in Baltimore, at no point are we talking about dynamic men and women who show up every day to educate. We're not talking about school-level administrators who have to balance a budget that's dictated by a higher level. And then we're not talking about support staff, paraprofessionals, all those admin folks that come in every day, even the folks that drive the buses and serve the lunches. We're talking about issues that take place at the highest levels. Before these folks show up for work in September and before they even meet their kids, the system is already broken. And I think a lot of times that blame falls back on teachers and school-level administrators, and everyone wants to go up to the school and get in the principal's face, not knowing that that principal is dealing with a budget that might have been smaller than it was last year, not knowing that that teacher is dealing with the fact that they've got a family of their own and they've got issues they've got to deal with, and they're caught in a system that's broken also. We talk about the kids being sentenced to failing schools. The teachers are sentenced to failing schools. They're sentenced to have to work in a corrupt system where they can't do the one thing they're most passionate about, which is educate children.
I agree it's great people, but we have to divide the question. Tonight, your questions have basically focused on potential criminality. That's one silo. The other silo is, forget the criminal, the other side is just the mere negligence that has become part of the status quo over decades. Great point. There are really good people in this system. There are teachers who live to teach these kids. But again, going back 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the numbers never change. The dysfunction never changes. The kids never get to these standardized levels of excellence. And we have a right as parents and taxpayers to expect it.
At the end of the day, where does the buck stop? Is it the CEO of the school? Is it the mayor? Is it the governor?
It's all of us. It's all, and that's not ducking your question. It's all of us, because it's an indictment on all of us when these numbers get reported in the media.
All right, I want to bring in part of the town hall. We hear from the people and the residents who live in these districts. I want to go to my colleague, Riel Creighton, who is talking to some of the people who have come out tonight. Riel, what are you hearing from our crowd?
Well, Mackenzie, I'm here with Blanca Tapuasco. She's a mother. She's somebody who's very active in the school system, but she actually pulled her children out of the school system because she did not feel that it was performing. But she had one very big question tonight, and I think this really gets at the crux of what we're talking about.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Wanted to share with the panel regarding education. There are 20 students in my block, just the one block that we live in. 6 moved before their children started school. They said, we're not going to be staying here. We have to move because we have to think of education. 6 moved, sold their homes. 5, because these are neighbors. I've been living there 15 years. We just paid off our home in February. We know each other very well. 5 decided private school was their best option, and they went from pre-K all the way to the graduated. Now they have their own families. You would think that the rest of them, 9, went to those local zone school. No. The rest had to be in lotteries. They talked to the principal. They went to City Springs. I personally moved to Fells Point. That way my son could go to Wolf Street. That way he had a chance to get to Crossroads. That way he had a chance to get to Mergenthaler, where he is an honor student. That's what parents have to do. We had a house. I had to move. That way I could be in the zone, because our local zone school did not perform to the level. So I'm not the only one here. That's just one block. But look at the people that moved, Governor Erler. That's 6 families that did not want to choose even to live in Baltimore City, alone choose to take their children. Before they were 3 years old, they were gone. Okay. They were gone. So my question is, where do we go from here? Because I am at the point, I volunteer, I teach English. I'm about to do 3 months in West Baltimore to tutor children who are 2, 3, 4 grade levels. I have a 12th grade who is going to graduate from a Baltimore City school, and she cannot read 4th grade. Her mom asked me, please tutor my daughter. Where do we go from here? Because we cannot have the same conversation, and children are being failed. And for any politician that's hearing this, parents have stepped up, parents have showed up, panelists have shown up, and allies have shown up. When are you going to show up?
Pastor Wright, maybe you could answer that question.
So I'd have to say, the ball is really in your court. If you're a parent and you're in this city and you're that angry, are you angry enough to actually make changes? Are you angry enough to work with folks to get some ballot initiatives for recall, for term limits? Because see, what happens is you elect a mayor that's from the same network of folks kind of milling around in the same pot. They pick the Board of Ed picks the superintendent, and then everybody washes their hands. See, good leadership owns the problems. We don't have that in Baltimore. So the question then is really back at you. What are you willing to do to seek change? Are you willing to support a resolution to dissolve the current school board and get a completely elected school board? Are you willing to support a ballot initiative for recall options and for term limits? Those are the things that let the politicians know you don't have to be here, but we're coming for you. That's where we're at.
Obviously a very passionate parent here. Maybe if every member of the panel could weigh in on that question, where do we go from here?
Well, I believe where we go from here is, just as Pastor Wright said, is are we angry enough now to do something about this? That is the real question, because the earlier question, where the question was, where's the buck stop? And the governor gave us a great answer where it looked like he was ducking the question, but he was actually answering it. Guess what? The buck stops with everyone in this room. The buck stops with every voter and taxpayer in Baltimore. We have to have the courage to go to the ballot and say we no longer want failing schools. We have to go to the ballot and we have to say we want leadership that even if there is an issue, they'll own that just as much as they'll own a success. We have to go to the ballot and we have to say these are the things we want. We're tired of population loss because we know that school consideration is a big part of population loss. Mm-hmm. People are moving out of Baltimore City before their kids have to go to these schools. These are tax dollars that we're losing. These are hardworking citizens that are moving to other jurisdictions and they're leaving because one of their considerations is schools. If it's not crime, it's education. So we have to then say, you know, if you can make that kind of decision, if you'll uproot your entire family, then what does it hurt to take a chance on a candidate that doesn't mill around in the same pot as everyone else? And guess what? If that guy or gal doesn't get it done, vote them out in 4 years also.
Okay, Saru.
You know, we expect families in Baltimore City right now to pay twice as much in taxes for some of the worst schools in the region and the highest murder rate in America. So it is no surprise that your neighbors are moving. There's no surprise that your neighbors that can afford it are choosing private school. And this is something that we all know. Let me give one very concrete thing that we can do to try to improve this system. It wasn't an accident that the two schools that you mentioned, City Springs and Wolf Street Academy, Hampstead Hill Elementary, the school that I mentioned, all happen to be charter schools. If you go look at the two cities that I know of where there were dramatic changes in a school system that was very broken virtually overnight, New Orleans and Washington, D.C., there was one thing in common. They had a huge reliance on charter schools overnight because of leadership. And again, respectfully, of course it's all of our responsibility, but I hate the idea that we get to allow our mayor and our city council a pass. They're the ones that pass the budget. Hundreds of millions of dollars doesn't go to the school system until the school board presents it to the city council, who approves it, and the mayor ratifies it. The mayor appoints every member of the school board. The notion that they are immune from responsibility, shame on them. There was a mayor in New York City, Mayor LaGuardia, who once said, if a pigeon dies in the park, it's my fault. That's not what city politicians in Baltimore do. It is what leaders do.
And Governor Ehrlich, you actually introduced charter schools to the state of Maryland.
Yes.
I don't know if you can maybe weigh on what can be done at an executive level.
I love that last answer because I remember the night on Sine Die, my first year as governor, when the Teachers Association and selected members of the legislature tried to kill a first charter school bill in the history of our state, which our administration was sponsoring, because it was inconvenient, I guess, or they didn't want the competition. They didn't want the excellence. Again, the denominator with respect to our panel and that question and the nods I see around this church is anger and frustration, and maybe at some point soon we're not going to take it anymore, and you've heard great answers here. I'll just say this. Thank you for coming here tonight. The story you gave us is truly instructive. Jurisdictions, states, localities, we spend millions of dollars bragging about our city, our state, whatever it happens to be. As governor, you go out there and you say, please come to Maryland, please bring your business, bring your tax dollars. Baltimore City does the same thing. With schools this dysfunctional, it's at the very foundation. With dysfunctional schools, that money is wasted, because you're not going to draw middle-class folks back, let alone wealthy folks back to this tax base. If they have kids, you're not. When precisely people who literally don't have a whole lot of money in the first place are choosing to go because their kids are being deprived of their constitutional rights. You know, lawyers talked about constitutional rights. This is not a privilege. The courts have held these kids have a constitutional right to a public education. To the extent we fail these kids, generation over generation in this city, and we've seen the results, it's our fault. So this is not a discretionary act of government, again, which hopefully goes to the anger and the temperature that we'll leave you with tonight. I love the answer, Pastor. Organize, organize, organize. A school board, elect, whatever it happens to be. Organize, demand accountability, because the other bottom line to this whole discussion tonight is the A word. We haven't really used it. It's accountability. There's no accountability. Why is there no reaction? Why is nobody here tonight? Why did the questions not get answered? Why did the tax dollars get wasted year after year? Because there's no accountability ever. There's lots of high-sounding, sounds good when you say it real fast speeches in Annapolis and in the city council, but nothing ever changes. And until enough people care enough to do something about it, it never will.
Okay, Blanca, thank you. Mackenzie, we'll send it back to you.
All right, thanks, Rio. Governor, like you brought up Annapolis and accountability. And when it comes to the budgets, we know that the funding for city schools comes from federal, state, and local tax dollars. Do you think it would be appropriate for leaders in Annapolis to look at potentially withholding funding for city schools until there is some sort of accountability? Is that even possible?
Likely not, one. Two, you don't want to punish the good teachers in the good schools. Three, you'll be in court real fast. And four, there are better ways to secure that accountability I'm talking about. But I get the frustration. I get the option because politicians tend to respond to where the dollars are.
What I think you could do, Mackenzie, I think Governor's right about the structure of it, but what you could do is to have a hearing, as we do every year, about the budget and say to the CEO of schools, look, we're about to send you hundreds of millions of dollars. We're about to approve a $1.2 billion budget, just as we did last year. But we got to ask you, we want to ask you about 5 schools in particular. This school, this school, this school, and this school. Here's what happened last year. What do you expect this year? We're about to send you $1.2 billion. Can you confidently report to us what you're going to do to improve performances at these schools? And can I ask you something, Dr. Santalese? If they aren't going to improve, is it really appropriate for you to ask us for another $1.2 billion next year? That kind of tough questions, because the city council, they're not supposed to be a bunch of cheerleaders. They're supposed to be journalists. They're supposed to be prosecutors. They're supposed to be holding the people that they're about to give $1.2 billion of your money. The people that are getting that money are supposed to be held accountable by them. And I wish there were more Democrats on this stage, but I don't want this to be a partisan issue. Barack Obama supported charter schools. There are things that we can do that are in the public interest, that are not partisan issues, that unite us all, that are good for our children. And all we need to do is to get our leaders to listen. This is the first time that Fox 45 has gone one district after another paying attention. Maybe this will wake them up, because this kind of attention, this kind of relentless vigilance is exactly what we need in Baltimore City, and more power to the people that show up every time hoping and praying for better.
I love that answer.
Pastor Red, I want to direct this question to you because Councilman Dorsey, he obviously represents this district, again, not up here tonight, ignoring us. In fact, when we invited him, he tweeted out saying that our emails to him from our station go right to his junk folder, asking him questions that his constituents deserve and have the right to have the answer to. He's had a history of being adversarial to members of the press. In fact, he told our parent company, Sinclair Broadcast Group, to drop dead. Is it appropriate to have an elected member of the city government be that adversarial to members of the press?
Unfortunately, the councilman for this district is the problem child of city council. They allow him to do things that no parent in their right mind, if they saw their child doing, would allow. But that seems to be the mentality in Baltimore, not just with the 3rd District's councilman, but with our current prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby. When you're a parent and your child does something wrong, you don't say, okay, well, I'll catch that next time. Because next time it's something different and it's something bigger. When there is a problem, you put a stop to it. You make sure that it is clear that there is a line and you do not cross it. But in Baltimore City, the line keeps moving. The problems keep getting bigger, and soon there won't be enough rug to sweep it under. Good leadership stops sweeping and starts taking care.
Mr. Wright, I want to direct this question to you as well, because we also have had the conversation about the councilman's thoughts towards police. Last year, he called for the removal of the FOP memorial statue downtown on President Street, the one that's there in honor of fallen police officers. Do you think that this view of law enforcement, when we know that crime and education and law enforcement are all connected, how does that play into this conversation? And do you think that his view on some of these issues is also appropriate?
Well, I've never sat down and had a personal conversation with the councilman about his views, so I'm not going to talk about a man that's not in the room. But what I will say is having that kind of adversarial personality makes any kind of working relationship difficult. It makes any kind of compromise difficult. It makes any kind of form of leadership difficult. I know that it is a leadership style. I've studied it before. It may get something done sometimes, but it's not going to foster the types of relationships we need to marshal all of our resources and go after some pretty big issues that face us as a city. I mean, everyone who came out here this evening, I wouldn't be surprised if I told you Baltimore has a crime issue, would I? I wouldn't be surprised if I told you that, we're on our way to 350 homicides real quick, or that the schools have been kind of jacked up for a while. So everyone sees the elephant in the room, but we don't address it. And if you have an elected official that won't talk to the press, won't answer the people's questions, but still pulls 90% of the vote every election, folks, the buck stops with us. If we don't like the councilman's mentality, if we don't like his abrasiveness, if we don't like his way he deals with either the press or other government agencies, the police department, you got to vote.
I do want to remind you and everyone else that the councilman was invited tonight. He again ignored our invitation, refusing to show up here and partake in this discussion with you and his own constituents. I want to go to the quarterly hearings. That was one thing that did come out of this so-called hearing that was held last week with the Education Committee. Quarterly hearings with the school board. If we continue to see activity where these questions are not asked, is quarterly hearings really going to impact or do anything? Ms. Wright, I see you shaking your head. Everybody here shaking their head here. Pastor Wright, why don't you take a stab at that question?
Absolutely not. The hearings were stagecraft. That's all it was. The questions were scripted. The responses, predictable. The one councilman that asked a question prefaced it by saying, the problems we're seeing at Augusta Fells have been going on since I was in school here. So that kind of negates the whole argument of Augusta Fells being an anomaly. It's not. It's a systematic problem. So until people can systematically wake up and actually do something, and that something is vote, that something is write letters, that something is show up to places like this, that something is going to your councilman's house, knocking on the door and saying, hey, I can't catch you at City Hall, but can we talk about something? Until you are ready to actually do something, then I would say to those that are unhappy, sit down and be quiet. This is grown folks' time to actually do something. And if you're not a part of the solution, then you too are a part of the problem.
We know that City Hall is closed. We don't know when it's going to reopen to the public. And you mentioned Antonio Glover, the councilman who asked that one question. I have it here. He asked the CEO of city schools what is she doing to change the culture in city schools? The CEO was a bit defensive of it and said that she can't be people's personal ethical guide. If she can't be and set the tone and set the policies for city schools, who can?
Well, shouldn't her $340,000 ensure that she is?
Mr. Vignarajah.
Look, you know, what's ironic about this is when it comes to getting tough questions from the media, if Donald Trump was dodging questions, if Donald Trump was being critical of the media, if he was being rude and acerbic, Ryan Dorsey and Zeke Cohen and Brandon Scott would be the first ones to jump out of their seats and say how unpresidential that was, how undignified that was. And yet they feel so comfortable in their positions that they ask questions about whether there's soap in the bathrooms. Now, look, that's a relevant question. If I had 150 questions, that would be 149. But if you have 2 questions, and that's what you're asking about, it means that you don't understand the seriousness of purpose that is required of your position. If you don't understand the urgency of the situation, and I think what's hard for me is I don't think we're all people that have run for office. Some have been successful, some have been unsuccessful. At the end of the day, we've all run for office. Politicians don't get to choose the journalists that cover them. Politicians don't get to choose what questions are asked of them. One of the hard parts of the job is being asked tough questions. You don't like those questions, but it's part of your responsibility to answer them. And if you ignore that part of your responsibility, then it's not that surprising when they turn around and ask questions that they throw softball after softball after softball, because those are the only questions that they know to get or to give.
Former Governor Ehrlich, I wanted to get your take on this too, because as a former executive of this state, when you were leading this state, if this was happening, we know this has been an issue for many, many decades and years. Would you have conversations, and what would your message be to the leaders in the city to try and work on this and move this problem forward to find a solution?
Well, we tried and we failed. We were beat. There's no Republican governor that's going to come into Baltimore City and try to help failing schools. And that was partisan, and that stunk. And to this day, it's the worst single chapter of my professional life, the most disappointing. And anybody around me, my wife, any of my former staff will tell you it was because, again, as I said earlier, there's 3 levels here. One's immoral. What we're talking about is immoral. It's immoral, objectively. Kids not educated, flunking out, failing, on the streets, making bad decisions. Secondly, constitutional. They're being deprived of their constitutional rights. It's the law. And third, just pragmatic. To the extent our system fails, more of our kids end up in the criminal justice system. And then we're shocked. So I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask because we were told to pound sand when we demanded accountability, and everything was okay. And then we were out. And 15 years later, we're having the same discussion. And 15 years ago, before that, they had the same discussion. And in 15 years, unless we reach this point, this inflection point, we're going to have the same discussion. So if there's any message the four of us, I think, want to leave, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter, leave with everyone here tonight watching in the church, is we need to really do something. We've talked about what something is. We've all given our ideas about what something is. Showing up, running, demanding accountability, screaming bloody murder. I don't care what it is. But the status quo is unacceptable. Some of it's criminal, maybe. That's criminal. But the rest of it's mere negligence. It's the status quo. It's okay. It never demands accountability. It never demands leadership. And when you get to the whole bottom line of tonight's discussion, we're talking about leadership. Leaders do inconvenient things. Leaders, I love Churchill. I've studied Churchill. Churchill lost elections. He said inconvenient things his whole life. He was talking about the Nazis when nobody was talking about the Nazis. He was called a warmonger. Leaders are often not appreciated in their era. Dr. King. Leaders do inconvenient and say inconvenient things for the betterment of us. And I don't see that happen in Baltimore City. I see it happen in some other cities, but I don't see it happening here, and I've never seen it here. Maybe going back to William Donald Schaefer.
A couple of weeks ago, I asked Mayor Brendan Scott if he would call an independent hearing, an investigation into what happened in Augusta Fells. This was after the report and the investigation came out. He told me that I didn't know how government works. So we did a little bit of homework, and we read the charter. We talked to the director of legislative reference in Baltimore City, the person who knows the charter inside and out. And he says that the charter says the mayor can call a special meeting if public business demands it. So my question, Pastor Wright, is the city school situation, is it a crisis enough? Does the public business demand it for the mayor to call a hearing?
I'm so glad you asked me that question. So Mayor Scott's response was because he doesn't understand the concept of leadership. Because good leadership would tell you whether the charter says it or not, you do it. Sometimes you got to do what you need to do. You don't ask permission. You ask for forgiveness after, especially if you remember the fact that being elected is public service. And in the greater service of the public, you better do what you need to do. And that means you call that hearing. That means you ask those hard questions. That means you hold folks accountable. And if they don't answer, you say publicly, I can't make them do it, but you all can. We have a problem that didn't happen overnight. It's not going to get fixed overnight. But if you give me a minute, if you work with me, together we can fix it. Until I hear that, we don't have leadership here. So I wouldn't expect the mayor to know what the charter says because he probably hasn't read it. But I have. He has more authority than he realizes. He continues to abdicate that authority and hope that everybody watching is asleep enough that they won't recognize that they also have the power to hold him accountable. And he has the ability to hold everyone accountable.
If this isn't a crisis... If this isn't a crisis with city schools, the connection that we're seeing with crime, we know you mentioned it. We're on track to surpass 300 homicides for the 7th year in a row in Baltimore City. If this isn't a pivotal moment, what does that pivotal moment look like for Baltimore City?
It's a sad moment. When you look at crime, first of all, in Baltimore City, we call crime public safety. Public safety, being safe, it obviously is not what we're talking about. See, Baltimore will put I can't say this in a church. We'll put stuff to make stuff taste different on stuff instead of calling it what it is. Okay? This ain't got nothing to do with public safety. This has to do with crime. And crime comes from hope for a better future leaving and desperation for seeing what's around you coming in, bringing its luggage and its children and staying. So until you fix the schools and people figure that it's a good investment, their children will get a good education. And then companies start saying, well, if the schools are good, maybe we can come back here. And then we start to bring jobs in. And then we fix the food deserts, which we don't want to call deserts anymore. We want to call them food challenge priority areas, because, again, more sweet stuff on other stuff. But until we have leadership that really understands how to pull up their big boy pants, tie them up tight, and get the job done, call it what it is, and take it head on, we're not going to see change.
I want to bring back Riel Creighton. I see you over there talking to more folks who have come out tonight to join us. Riel, what are you hearing?
Well, I'm here with Claudia Toll. She probably is a familiar face to you. She's a Fells Point business owner, recently announced she actually was closing her business, but she's not exactly your average citizen because she has announced to run for the 1st District, which is Zeke Cohen's seat. But Claudia, you had a question regarding what you believe we've sort of normalized, a situation that is not right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that have been normalized in Baltimore City that in any other part of the country and the world would be outrageous. And we've talked, the panel has talked about accountability. That is a huge issue that we have. But we also talk about this divisiveness that we have witnessed in past elections at the federal level that has now, the same antics I've experienced them personally, a tit for tat, support me or I can't support you. These elected officials are there to, as you said, serve their constituents. How is it that Zeke Cohen, Ryan Dorsey, who is the representative here, and Zeke Cohen for District 1, how is it that they constantly get away with not showing up, with not participating, and in fact creating maybe chatter around their critics of lack of standing or understanding when asking questions that lead to accountability, this divisiveness of Democrat and Republican. I mean, Governor Ehrlich, I worked with your administration back in the day with regards to Patterson Park Public Charter School and Hampstead Hill Academy, a New Schools Initiative that took charter. How do we create opportunity for community members? How do we create hope for community members? Because I can tell you from personal experience, as a small business owner, as a resident of District 1, as a realtor whose livelihood is based on marketing and attracting people to Baltimore City, I don't see the resources, the opportunity for others to engage at a level that we create real change. So what would you say, and we've talked in generalities, but what are some concrete opportunities for not just District 1, not just District 3, but we see these representatives who are elected who we could argue come from very privileged backgrounds, right, who are not part of an immigrant community, who are not small business owners directly, who have had to earn every dollar, sign a paycheck, and be accountable for someone's livelihood. How do we create opportunities for our communities to respond? I'm angry. I'm so angry that I've announced way in advance, been told by many people that it's unorthodox. I believe that we need to do things differently. I don't have all the answers, which is why I want to announce early, so I know that I can speak to people. How do we create this change if we do continue to do the same things, if we don't have our communities engaged?
Mr. Vignarajah, maybe you could start us off on that.
Yeah, I'll start by making a really important observation, because this will require relentless focus by the people and by the media. We need to make noise early and often, this sort of drumbeat of energy that needs to start now, that needs to be here this month and next month and the month after. Your election is, 3 years away, but you are stepping up now. I applaud you, because if you're going to take on the system, it's going to require that kind of relentless energy. It's going to require for people to get to know you, for people to understand the failures of Zeke Cohen. There were 3 murders in Baltimore City yesterday. 3 murders on a Monday in September yesterday, and I bet not a single one of you has heard a whisper from your city council president, from your mayor, from anyone. Before I was on my way here, I just looked up quickly to see whether or not Ryan Dorsey had commented on it. His Twitter feed, he had a tweet about his buddy who he walked the Appalachian Trail with. No comment about the 3 people that were killed in Baltimore City. The council president tweeted about the fact that there was a candidate he was supporting in Virginia, and the mayor tweeted about the fact that we had new software in Baltimore City. That's where they think they can get some good noise and good press. They want to ignore the fact that 3 people were killed on our streets in Baltimore.
You asked a question, why people don't show up, politicians? The answer is they think they have safe seats. That's the answer, period. If you think you have a safe seat, often you're not motivated to show up because you have a safe seat. And monopolies are arrogant and lazy because they can be. Secondly, I disagree a little bit with the premise disagree. I just want to make an observation. You use this term disruptor and all that. It's okay to be a disruptor. Be inconvenient. If they're saying nice things about you, you're really not making progress. Okay? It's okay, and that's coming from a former politician anyway. If everybody loves you, you're not doing the right thing more likely than not. If people aren't angry, my wife, my lovely, loyal wife, and my friends and my staff, we would get upset when people were sneering at me in public. And I go, you know what? We're making an impact. That guy's sneering at me. We're disrupting the status quo. We're changing things. That's good. Don't ever back away from that. When people start calling you names, they're scared. People get emotional, they're scared. The status quo in this city has been this way forever, particularly with regard to the schools. The more people get angry, the more disruption, the more inconvenience, the more people showing up, the more screaming, the better off we're going to be.
Pastor,
I want to say thank you just for stepping up and taking on the challenge of running for public office. I can tell you, as I've done it myself once, it's going to be daunting. It's going to be some rough days, long nights. But congratulations and Godspeed in your race. But you actually asked 3 separate questions, and I'd like to take a few seconds to take a swing at the 3 separate questions. Your first one was, where did the divisiveness in city politics come from? Now, I would argue against that. There's not a lot of divisiveness. There's just a one-party rule that is a gargantuan in the corner, and when you go against it, I'm a casualty of it myself, you don't make a lot of headway. So the conversation we need to have more often than not is not the party of the candidate. What are the policies of the candidate? Where's this candidate drawing their funding from? Who does this candidate associate with? Who's going to be their partners if they do get elected? Because a lot of times the writing's on the wall that such and such and such and such went to high school together. They both were pages for this congressman. They both went to this school. They both have this circle of friends. They're both drawing funding from this special interest group. So we kind of can figure out they're going to be really good friends. They have aligning policies that don't agree with what we want to see done in the city, and they're both in the same party. They're not going to rat each other out. They're going to work together. Your second question was, why does Zeke and Ryan get away with this? It's because no one's holding them accountable. Accountability is a word that we've thrown around a lot today. But guess what? They can blow off events like this, and they'll still get 70% in the primary and probably 90% in the general election. So when there's no accountability, you have those issues. And the third question was hope. If we want to restore hope to Baltimore City, we got to do something about the first 2 issues. We have to do something about our elected officials, make them accountable to the people. We have to do something about crime, which is, again, making our elected officials accountable to the people so that the policies that are put forward are dealing with crime. They're lowering that homicide rate, and they're allowing us to put heinous and violent criminals behind bars. And we have to improve our schools, because that's the way we draw citizens, taxpayers, and a tax base that allows us to pay for all those things.
Pastor Wright, if you could weigh in, also a former candidate.
Okay, Baltimore City is a business. It's a company. It should have moving parts that kind of work together. So until the people like you, but not exactly you because you're doing something about it, wake up and realize you're the city councilman's boss. You put them there. So you're asking, when are they going to do whatever? When are you going to stop paying them to not do what you want them to do? That's number 1. Number 2, how many people in here get paid a salary, could go to work, do what they want to do, and still think they'd have a job? I didn't think so. Got to change the mentality. If folks are unhappy with what they're seeing, if they're unhappy with the results that they're getting, if the brakes on your car go out, you take it to the mechanic, you pay the bill, and the mechanic says, well, 41% of the time, you'll probably not fail. Would that be okay? It can't be okay. It can't be okay. And as long as the folks here that are elected think it is, they will continue to do it. Until the folks here stand up and say, this is not acceptable, my brakes better work 41% of the time. It's not going to change. Each and every one in here has the ability to change it, though.
Pastor Wright, thank you very much. Mackenzie, we'll send it back to you.
All right, thanks, Rael. Pastor Wright, I want to bring this up because you talked about 41%. Those are the percentage of high school students in Baltimore City right now that has a GPA of 1.0 or lower. That was from the first 3 quarters of the school year. We talk a lot about accountability. We're seeing no members of the electorate here tonight. How many students will continue to fail in Baltimore City before these elected leaders and the constituents make enough noise and get angry enough? How many students will have to be graduating unprepared for whatever's next, whether that's college, a job, a career tech? How many students will have to fail before something actually changes?
I'm going to answer that in a roundabout way. Interestingly enough, most of these events are in churches, okay, or in houses of worship, regardless of the faith. in the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran, what you do to the least of them, you do to me. So until the folk that actually believe in those books stand close and hold those principles dear, we're not going to see a change. We're not going to see a difference. Folks will only do what they're allowed to do. If you believe in the higher power, if you believe that there's a reason and that we're supposed to be good to each other, love thy neighbor and all that other good stuff, then you have to expect your leaders to do the same thing. And good leadership would not only be owning that, but trying to spread that. And we don't have that here.
Governor, like you talked about your administration 15 years ago and wanting to make a change and not having any success with Baltimore City, especially when it comes to city schools. Looking at where we are now, where do you think the city, not only schools, but overall, when it comes to crime and economic development, where would the city be had you been successful?
I don't know. But I do know this. I strongly suspect this, that there would have been more successful kids in life because they would have been given a higher quality education when it really counted. And more likely than not, less kids in the system, the criminal justice system, as a result of what we did. So, as I said, I'm no hero. I'm not saying I was. I'm just Nancy Grasmick, superintendent, came to me one day and said, we have 11 schools that are literally failing. The numbers in some of these schools are single digits as far as passing functional tests. And we have a federal statute we can actually use to do something. And I just wanted everybody here who may not remember this just to go back and think about that opportunity and those kids who you'll never see their faces, you'll never know their names, you'll never know what they did in life, but because the system beat them, and the system even celebrated beating them, which I never got over to this day. It made the city marginally worse, and made lives marginally worse, and made, hopefully, 15 years later, tonight, made us a little bit angrier and more committed to change.
Thank you so much. We have to wrap it up. An hour went by fast. I want to thank all of our panelists and the residents who came out tonight. We will continue to do these town halls. Hopefully our elected leaders will show up and join us and participate in these conversations with their constituents. And again, thank you to everyone for coming tonight. Have a great evening.
I'm Dan Miller.
I'm Kevin Stern. At Miller Stern Lawyers, we are honored to serve the community that we love. We work for you.
For over a decade, we've spent our days and nights fighting for you. We believe in justice. We believe in fighting for what's right.
That's why we are proud to sponsor a community conversation to make a better Baltimore.
It takes guts to stand up for justice and accountability and demand better.
And we can do it by giving you a voice in your future.
At Miller Stern, we're fighting for a better Baltimore.